As I've stated time and time again, the Resident Evil franchise has had a history of ups and downs. One of the reasons the series remained popular among the vast array of horrors of the past was Capcom's interest in trial and error, experimenting with new approaches to the franchise and getting out of its comfort zone. With the series hosting works, has turned the franchise into a huge museum of different experiences. And if you look at it, you can see many different identity changes and dimensions of the gaming industry as a whole that are at the heart of each of the titles in the series, making Resident Evil always unique and has something to offer, even in the worst of circumstances. Today, we are going to go over one of these special titles that I personally consider an underrated work. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that the criticism of the work has been unwarranted, but rather it implies that I think it's an experience that, along with its weaknesses, contained many fascinating qualities that didn't necessarily get so much attention. And that's why it's always been one of the most special works in the franchise for me. Resident Evil. Dead Aim turned 20 years old, so I decided to remember this and all the surviving shooters who have memories of it. Resident Evil Dead Aim was the latest installment in the Gun Survivor series, which began with Resident Evil Survivor and was known in Japan as Gun Survivor 4 Biohazard. Heroes never die. I think you all know that Survivor wasn't such a good experience, and while I think there are some positive, distinguishing features in it, you generally realize after experiencing it that this game has no special value for Capcom, and it was more of the same trial and error that I talked about above. It was merely a test ground for a raw idea, which, of course, eventually matured. Resident Evil Dead Aim solved many of the problems of the Survivor version, and although it was not a perfect effect, you could feel when experiencing it that the creators had a lot of love and belief in their game, and this issue in many aspects of it that makes it a very respectable version of it personally. I remember in the fisheries that some people don't talk about it at all. With this work, Capcom showed that it had learned many lessons from the franchise's two previous Gun Survivor, and now it was able to combine survival horror and first-person shooter, not at its best, but optimally, to deliver a work that truly conveyed the feel of an authentic RE experience. In this period, due to the contract between Nintendo and Capcom, more commonly referred to today as Capcom's betrayal of Nintendo, the company was not allowed to make another original version for the PS2 due to the monopoly of the issue, and only Capcom Studios 1 and 3 were allowed to make Resident Evil for the PS2. Since the franchise needed to move forward and deliver content until the fourth version release, and Capcom couldn't completely abandon PS2, it was a good idea to look at the Gun Survivor series again. But one thing was obvious this time, and Capcom couldn't risk using the name Survivor, which doesn't sound so desirable among its fans, to create its new work, because it certainly wasn't a lot of people who didn't like it, so it decided to use the idea in a new and improved format. That's why the first Resident Evil game was created, which used a third-person camera and offered a first-person hybrid. Let me start by talking about the part that I really think is the weakest part of the experience. The story and characters of the game, just like the classic franchise titles, still exaggerate that special feeling and campy with them. But the problem is that this time, the narrative and writing of the game is extremely superficial, and more is trying to be a stimulus for the flow of the game. But I remember when I was first experiencing this game was a lot of how I enjoyed the presentation of the story, and of course there were many reasons involved. I can dare say that the presentation of this work in the history of this series is single, and one of the reasons why this work has become a memorable experience for me was this. On arrival, the game enters you with a very interesting introductory with a mysterious music that quickly made me fall in love with it and reminded me of crime movies of the 90s and even the early 2000s. The fact that this introduction was on a Resident Evil game made me so excited to experience it. A horror experience with criminal seasoning in the Resident Evil world was what this introduction felt to me. 4 years after the events of the second game, you play as Bruce McGivern, a U.S. Stratcom agent. Morpheus D. Duval, a former Umbrella researcher, threatened the U.S. and China with a biological missile attack after stealing the T virus from the Paris lab if he refused to comply with his $5 billion request. Bruce sets foot on the Spencer Rain, which now has nothing left but the moving bodies of the passengers and the ghosts of those who took their lives to escape the nightmare they were trapped in. At the same time, China had sent MSS Agent and the game's supporting character Fong Ling to the ship, which was not allowed to cooperate because of the differences between the two countries, but during the story, this will change. It's also worth noting that playing during the experience allows you to play his role as well. While Morpheus doesn't have an interesting characterization, using version 0, 9.2 of the T+G virus makes the character experience one of the strangest mutations in franchise history, and that still leaves me with this antagonist. Generally, the story of the game wasn't a big deal, and about a year ago, when I finished it again on the PS2 emulator, I realized that its story sometimes creates contradictions and strange holes in the lore series. And as someone who cares so much about lore this series, this issue was not so pleasant to me. And I think the author of this version it has had a very superficial knowledge of the totality of the series, so that you feel that a list of RE's general structural features of storytelling has been put aside and is just enough to do just that. However, as I said, the way this story was portrayed using cinematic cutscenes as well as the over-exaggerated style of the game at that time seemed very interesting and distinct to me from other franchise works, which was somehow a narrative so bad that it actually makes you unwilling to get involved in the so-called so-bad mode. It's good to self. Now that we've talked about some of the weaker parts of this experience, it's time to mention the qualities that kept this game forever in my mind, and the most important of which is the gameplay. It might be said that before Resident Evil 4 fully focuses on action, Dead Aim introduced this to the franchise in a broader way, and showed how a more focused action would look like than ever before. Of course, don't get me wrong, this version is not necessarily an all-action game, but it can be said that its action is more visible because of its special style. However, the problem is that I think this work very beautifully maintains the balance between action and the outstanding elements of survival horror, and in this way did not use jumpscare. The overall gameplay process was that your overall vision and movements were in the third person, and when shooting the game entered the first person and acted exactly like a light gun shooter's. However, many of the main elements of survival horror were still present in the game, including lack of ammunition, limited inventory and perimeter surfing, and backtracking, which reinforced the overall experience of the game to become a true survival horror effect. One of the things that makes me so much respect for this work was adhering to the horror principle of the franchise and creating a deeply immersive and mysterious experience that blends beautifully with its own world and scares you. The Spencer Rain was truly terrifying at the time, and even a year ago when I experienced it again, I still felt the heaviness of the atmosphere. The atmosphere and ambience of the game was so great that it still yields great results. This version until that time more than any other version of the Dark, and used it to reinforce your fear, so that in most parts of the game, the only thing that made you have a relative view of your surroundings was Bruce's flashlight, almost like the classic Silent Hill trilogy. I remember wandering around in a dark room where I could only see a few centimeters around me with the help of my flashlight, but in the dark I noticed that the bathroom door was open and a suspended shadow stood in front of me. I can't describe how shocked I was at that moment, and so I started shooting at that shadow, thinking, how is that possible? At the same time, the flashlight of my gun made me see a relative view of the suspended object, and it was at this point that I stopped shooting. When I approached it and the light of my flashlight pushed away the shadows, I saw that it was actually the body of a man who had tried to escape the hell devouring his companions by hanging himself. And at this moment, my sense of fear and stress was mingled with curiosity and ruin. As I've mentioned in the past, it's these moments that connect me more than ever to a scary experience, especially Resident Evil, when I feel like the environment, space, sound, and all aspects of the game move in harmony and create dynamic moments for the player. The first person of the game during shooting also helps to make the process tense. Let me give you another example from my own experience. I remember walking down a very dark corridor when I suddenly heard a few groans in the darkness, where I immediately entered the shooting mode and slowly moved forward. Nothing was clear in the dark, and that made me feel more anxious about the danger that was right in front of me. Meanwhile, the flashlight lit up the face of one of the zombies moaning toward me, and it was really scary to look at these creatures from this distance in their time. The creators also gave a lot of importance to zombies, their design and how they work, so that along with diversity, almost for the first time, the game showed dynamic facial animations for the zombies so that you could watch their mouth movements when moaning. Along with that, their wobbling animations made these gray bodies seem more animated and realistic than ever. And while many of these animations were designed to challenge the player's aiming, they actually created vibrations and movements that penetrated my skin completely. In addition, the physical interaction of zombies with the game environment was something that had not been seen in the franchise until then, and even then it wasn't necessarily portrayed as such. For example, when you hit the zombie's headshot, they were thrown backwards with all the power. And according to the angle they were in, they hit the wall with a special animation and died while leaning against the wall. Sometimes, even if they hit the wall and slipped downwards, their blood trail was drawn on the wall. It gave a much more dynamic mood to the action scenarios that were very desirable in its own era. Speaking of targeting, I'll talk a little bit about this as well, because if you've played this game with a PS2 controller like me, you know what I'm going to talk about. Dead Aim was a light gun game that supported GunCon, and that's the main way to experience it. However, along with that, the developers greatly optimized the control of the game after numerous survivor problems in this area for the normal controllers to make the game experience easier. And while this happened in the field of movement, but in the context of aiming, anyone who has experienced at least one shooter game with the PS2 controller knows very well that how low the accuracy range of the analogs of this controller is. And this was a torment in such a work that is so important in order to store ammunition. You can get used to it after a while, but when you get to the end of the game, you know what a lot of pain you are going through. If you've played this game with the controller, you probably wanted to throw the controller at the TV as I did when you were fighting the final boss. But let's get past that and go back to the atmosphere of this work, because I think the most powerful part of the experience as a Resident Evil in that section. Another prominent feature of this game in order to create a scary trend and environment is lighting. So that I think the lighting of this game was far beyond the titles of its era in 2003, and even in some parts we saw the bloom effect, which was rarely seen in the 6th generation titles, especially on PS2 in general. Beside this great lighting, there was a sound of the play environment that was beautifully blended with its ambiance and mysterious tone with the outward design of the game environment and immersed you in it. Sometimes you would enter a room whose only source of light was the shimmering light of small lampshades beside the chaotic beds, while a gentle ambiance matched your eyes to the sounds while you slowly searched the room for ammunition or even the writings left by the victims of the ship. This is one of the most striking features of any horror work, and I think this game carries the weight of its name in this section as a Resident Evil. As you walk on the deck of Spencer Rain, the whining of zombies on it is combined with the sound of the roaring waves caused by the ship's splitting water. When you run down the narrow, dark corridors, the echoes of Bruce's heavy footsteps and the frightened breaths of Bruce were all features that were redepicted in the 4th version with higher efficiency. Along with these soundtracks, Resident Evil Dead Aim is undoubtedly one of the most underrated soundtracks in franchise history. From the great music of the introduction to the relaxing sound of Heroes, Never Die in the Living Room, and the gunshot music from Rise that followed you at the end of the game, all of the top of the series, and the identity and character of the independent and distinctive, they create this effect. Resident Evil Dead Aim wasn't a great experience, but it was a game that in its era well demonstrated what a RE could do and deliver using the potential of new hardware, and did a lot of work in the survival horror genre. From its space and lighting to soundtracking, music, and its dynamic third-person camera, it all moved to create a very atmospheric effect, which, if you ask me, certainly got there. The title portrayed a hybrid experience of survival horror and light gun in a more efficient way than ever before. And in this regard, it portrayed some new features and took very unique approaches to previous versions and even later versions. While still a Resident Evil at its core, the game was trying to learn from its past mistakes and move on to deliver a new and distinct experience. Dead Aim is more than a forgotten subtitle in this extraordinarily extensive franchise, and now that it's been 2 decades since its release, it was a good time to highlight the qualities that make it a worthy Resident Evil in my eyes.